Hey everybody, this is a quick documentational video to introduce and show you a few things about the StarScream starter project. StarScream, like you've probably been able to read in the README, is a starter project for a typical architecture for a web application. It uses NancyFX for the web framework. It uses Hibernate for the ORM. It uses CQRS type architecture for commands and queries, separating the two. It uses Blingbag for events. It uses Angular for the front end, and it uses. I feel like I'm leaving something out, but it uses a typical stack for a web project. And our idea behind StarScream is that you can, as a developer, you can start a new project very quickly that has a lot of functionality already built in. And we're still adding more functionality. So it's more than just login and some user management. It's going to have a lot more functionality that's very common that can also be turned on and off, which should be useful to start up, ramp up projects faster. Okay, on the call we've got Dante Dubon, Javier Suazo, and Victor Zavala, and I'm Byron Summerdahl. Let's go ahead and get into the code. Switch over to my screen. And can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I'll just run through some folder structure stuff, and then I'll stop for questions, just in case I leave something out. Start at the top. Right now we've got this email folder in here. This will likely come out in the course of the next sprint that we're about to work on. So future devs, you might not see this folder here. This is Ackland Avenue email. This is something that Victor and I have worked on at least twice. I've worked on it a few more times too. Probably every developer has created something like this. It's just a way of sending emails that's a little bit smarter than just newing up an SMTP client and sending a static email. So it uses things like the View Engine. I think it uses Razor View Engine. It uses email templates. It allows you to have injected email templates for subject and for email body. It allows you to use an HTML file and apply a model to the HTML file, just like a View Engine would for ASP.NET or something like that, where it takes the model properties and it binds them to the HTML and then just gives you HTML with all the properties already replaced. It's cool. Victor, you remember doing this a few times?
Yeah, I remember doing it for Hodl and for another project I can recall right now. But yeah, it's a lot of work that it'll be great not to repeat.
Yeah. So this one is written with test first development. So not a lot of tests, but I'm pretty sure that the code coverage is close to 100%. So I'm pretty happy with this. This one's going to be moved out to its own open source repository and then submitted to NuGet as a NuGet package, so we can just drop it into any project. So that should be going away pretty soon. The rest of the project is also written with test first development, and it's got this testing solution folder, and it's got for every assembly where we have code that was driven out by tests, there is a specs folder, and it's all using machine specification. So typically when we do acceptance test driven development like this, then we don't have a web specs, but in this case there is a web specs project because there was something in the web project, in the web assembly, that needed to be driven out by tests. So so that's this one right here. The domain specs, there are a few specs in here just for creating a user and creating a password, dispatching a command, things like that. and we got some validation specs. And then in this project, as I was building this, I tried not to use mock, which was a new thing for me. But what I did was I just created these stubs. So I'm not using MOQ or Rhino mocks or anything like that. I'm just using test stubs. So I imagine this right here is going to evolve over time, and as we get more mature in being able to use stubs like this instead of mocks, or we might end up just adding a lot of mocks using a mocking framework. Either way, as long as we're doing best for our future, then we'll be okay. The data specs has a lot of almost integration specs, but what they're doing is they're hitting an in-memory SQLite database. So they're actually running SQL. That's about as close as they'll get to an integration spec, because actually when the spec is finished running, the in-memory database goes away. So these try to exercise the repositories that we have. There's a read-only repository and a writable repository. I also imagine over time that's going to change as we get more familiar with CQRS. On the top of this list is the acceptance tests. We have spec flow acceptance tests, and each spec flow feature is written just like this. We've seen these before, and each line here, given, the when, and the and then the then, those end up getting translated down to step files. And so here's the login step file. And so you can see that here's a given with the same text that came from the feature, and then it's got some code that does the thing that it's describing here. Those are very useful for getting good end-to-end progress. These are actually running Selenium, and so they're actually opening up a browser and clicking around in the form and actually doing things. And then when it's finished, it closes the browser, and then you get to see whether the test passed or failed. It gives a lot of confidence. And we're also still getting used to the idea of automated acceptance tests. So this project will also be evolving over time. Questions about the testing project before I move on to the code projects?
No, I don't have.
Okay. All right, let's talk about deploying the database. So in development, it's very important to be able to quickly deploy a database without having to deal with a bunch of mess in SQL. So we have this database deployer, and those that are in Ackland Avenue for any time, they've seen this several times because we use it on almost every project that we do. And what it does is it looks at our domain project for any entities, anything that implements iEntity, and it looks at it using reflection, pulls in the project, the properties, creates the SQL that would be required to create the tables in SQL, all using convention, and then it actually generates the tables in the SQL database. It also has some functions in there to actually drop the database by dropping foreign keys first and things like that. So typically in a deployment server scenario, we would use this tool in an automated fashion as part of our automated script to drop the database completely and then rebuild it from zero, and then use what's called seeders. Here's a user seeder. Use a seeder to actually seed or populate the database with some data. So this is a typical seeder that we have in most of our projects where we're seeding a test user so that when we're testing, we can actually log in with this user using this email address and this password. That's the database deployer. So since I mentioned the domain, we'll go ahead and skip over to the domain. This is the heart of the project. It's not meant to be necessarily the only domain level project in the solution, but sometimes it ends up that way just because we may not always know how to split something out to another domain level project. or because the project might be small enough that we feel like there's only one domain needed. But right now in StarScream, when you pull it down, it should have a very core or common kind of domain project. In this particular domain project, there are some command handlers and some commands. So commands and command handlers comes from the idea of CQRS. So we've got a create user command, which takes in all the things that are needed to construct a user. Excuse me. And then we have a user creator, which takes in that command and then does something about it. So this one in particular is just creating a new user and then writing it or creating it in the database. And after it's finished, it notifies observers that the user was created, so that if there is for some reason some event that needs to be fired when the user's created, then we're pushing that event out into the eventosphere right here, so that it can be responded to later on. I think we got a command here for create password reset token. This is one that I'm working on right now. So that's like somebody said they forgot their password. So we're going to create a reset token using their email address, and then the command handler is going to get the user from their email address. It's going to generate a new ID. It's going to create that reset token, and then it's going to fire an event. Now, I'll go ahead and show you, since we're talking about events, I'll show you the one possible or an existing event handler that is that's being fired as a result of this guy. Yeah. So right now our event handling system, domain event handling system, is called Blingbag. And so it has an interface called Bling Handler. So if there's ever an event that fires, if you just create a Bling Handler that uses the type of event as its generic argument, then this right here, this handle, will be run as a result of that event. So in this case, we created a password reset token, and the event that fired said this token was created. Well, then the event handler then is going to get the user by its ID, and then it's going to send an email to the user. And here again, this is using our email sending infrastructure. So I'm passing in the email address, and then I'm just passing in a model. In this case, it's a password reset email model. Takes in the base URL and the token. Basically, it's just going to send a link to the user. That gets us covered on commands, command handlers, and events and event handlers.
Byron?
Yes, go ahead.
Are we going to have command validators?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me see. We may not
Do you have anyone?
We may not have any as an example right now, but that's definitely worth mentioning. Let me see if there's a type in here. Command validator. Okay, so we do have a command validator interface. Let's see if we have any. Yeah, there's a. Very good. Thank you for mentioning that. So when we dispatch a command. Let me talk about dispatching a command first. Let me skip over to the web server or web project here. In the API, there are modules, and I'm going to go to the user account module so that we can see how we dispatch a command to reset the password. So here's the method for resetting a password or requesting a password reset. So I'm going to bind. I'm going to pull basically all the data out of the request and put it into an object. That's what this does. And then I'm just going to dispatch a command. So I give the user session to the dispatch, and then I also give this create password reset token, which we just saw a few minutes ago. So let's drill into this command method and let's see how it works. Okay, so the first thing it does is it looks for any matching command validators. So I'm passing in the command here. It's just an object. So I've got this method here that goes out and just uses reflection and looks for any validators, any command validators that are out there. And it returns them as an IEnumerable. And then I'm invoking this method validate on the validators, on every one of them. So if for the password reset token request, we're passing in an email address, right? That email address should be a valid email address, and it should include an email address, so it should not be blank. So so it should be, we should have at least one validator in this loop of validators right here. I'm not sure if we do, but let's see. Command validator. Let's see if it's in use. I'm going to do it this way. Yeah, password reset validator. So this one, yeah, so we're creating the reset token. So here we're just checking to see if the validator, if it's not null or empty, so that if the email address is not null or empty. If it is, it's going to add a failure to the list of validation failures. Another thing that it does is it checks to make sure that the email address exists in our database. So it tries to get a user. If for some reason, this should be a item not found exception of user. So if it throws this item not found, then we should add a validator or a validation failure that says that the email address does not exist. See that? So if there are any validation failures, then it's going to throw this command validation exception that's going to contain all of the smaller validation failures, all in one response. So then let's see if I go back to command dispatcher. So here, this is all about validating the commands. I'm actually going to extract that out to a method. Validate command. So we're going to validate the command first. Then we're going to get the command handlers, and we're going to handle the command. So handling the command does something very similar to what the validation does. It goes out and gets the matching command handlers here, and then it's going to run through them each one, and it's going to initialize them, which initialize in this case lingbag initialize on the handler so that it wires up that domain event, the notify observer's domain event, and then it's going to invoke it. Now here's something that you may not have seen before, but in a typical or in a more advanced CQRS setup, we would be putting the commands into a queue, and that queue might get run immediately, or it might get run in 30 seconds or 5 minutes, depending on the backup of the queue. So the user isn't going to be sitting there waiting for the command to be fired to be handled. So we have to assume that everything is completely async. We don't know when it's going to be finished. So if we were to allow any exceptions to be thrown at this point, then we would basically be setting up our system to have a dependency on those exceptions that might get thrown from the commands. So when we dispatch a command, we should never expect that there are any exceptions that come back. Instead, if there's an exception that happens in a command, we should handle it in the command handler and raise events, domain events, and that's the better way to handle those exceptions. So in this case, I added this catch all that does absolutely nothing, and that way it swallows that exception, and so that we never get dependent on that. Okay, So, all right, let me back up to the domain again, since we were talking about the domain. We talked about validators right here. Let's talk about, we've already seen domain events. We try to keep all these things kind of separate into these folders. Let's talk about entities. An entity in domain-driven design is anything that has an identity. So in our case, in this small project, we have a password reset token, a user, and a user login session. So right now, these are the only three entities. But what it means is that every time we deploy the database, we're going to have three tables in the database. Each one of the tables is going to have columns that that match the properties on these entities. So our user table in the database has a name, an email address, a phone number, and an encrypted password. On these entities, we use the idea of encapsulation, where we have the only public constructors that we have take in the property construct the object. Our properties don't have public setters. They have, in this case, protected setters, because in Hibernate needs to be able to subclass these entities and actually change the values of the properties as it needs to. So we always use virtual, and all the setters are protected. But what that means is that nobody can new up a user and start changing properties and changing the state of an object almost without permission, or without knowing what they're doing. So the only way in this case, there is no way to change the name of a user. Sorry about the wind. There is no way to change the name of a user. Once the user is created, then there's no way to change that name, an email address, name, phone number, or password right now. The only thing that we can change is the email address, and that's because there's a method for changing the email address. So if we're going to have a way to change the name, or the phone number, or the password, then we're going to need to add methods for those things.
Byron, I have one question.
Okay.
Why we not put all the logic to validate the email on the entity, the user?
That's a good point, and that might be something that we have to change along the way as we try to improve the architecture of this project, and architecture of any project that we do, really. My first thought is, well, what if we have to change the validation scheme or the validation rules for that email address later on? Would that not be breaking open-close principle?
Well, I think we need another object, an email object. Really, it's a value object that describes the user, and that object should have the logic for the email validation.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's cool. So yeah, that for the people watching this video, that stuff might evolve over time. So the validation might change. A lot of things actually might change, but the principle of encapsulation would stay the same for sure. We want to make sure that we're not having public setters on things. All right, so that's entities for right now. The idea of a service in domain-driven design is something that something that does something. In fact, somebody else might have a better definition of a service. To me, it's just a class that does some work that doesn't necessarily belong on a command handler. For instance, all of our service interfaces are here: our command dispatcher, our email sender, our identity generator, things like that. So these are things that are going to be injected into a command handler to extract the work that needs to be done out to a separate class. Anybody have a better definition of a service? Nope.
No.
Nope.
Okay. It was awesome. My definition was so good. Okay. I see one exception in here though. I need to add an exception folder to the domain because there are lots of places where we need to raise exceptions instead of returning a result. So, for instance, this guy right here, no available handler exception, that needs to go into the exceptions folder. There. Cool. So, as we create more domain level exceptions, then we should put them into this exceptions folder. I've got a folder in here for value objects, and I've got the encrypted password in there. So at some point we might create a value object for email address and for other things that make sense to go in there. Hey, there's another exception. With me, I'm a folder Nazi. Domain exceptions. Cool. So, any questions about the domain before I move away?
Byron, I think we need to create another folder, one for application layer.
Is there something that we can move in there right now?
Yes, I believe that. Application.
Okay, what's something that we can move into that right now?
I believe the commands and command handler.
Okay, let's do it. Application down here. Okay. Any other questions or suggestions?
Service validator. I see the validator like domain logic. I see the validators is more from another layer, like an adapter layer or something like that. Because it's more like purify the data that enter in the domain in arranging.
Okay. Yeah, we may have to move that out in a separate card and make that decision a little bit later.
Yes.
All right. Any other questions about domain?
No, I'm fine. Fine. Everything is really clear.
One thing that I should mention is that there are pretty much almost no references in the domain. Domain should be pretty clean. It shouldn't have references to things like Razor View Engine, JSON.NET, REST Sharp. Definitely shouldn't have any references to other projects in the same solution. So domain would never have a reference to the web project, meaning that domain is not dependent on the web project. The domain is not dependent on the data project. On the other hand, the data project is dependent on the domain. The web is dependent on the domain. So that's why I say that the domain project or the domain assembly is at the core of the application. It radiates out. Nothing radiates in. Blingbag is one exception. Obviously, some typical like system core and things like that, but Blingbag is one exception because Blingbag is providing infrastructure support to the domain. All right, so let's jump up here to the data project. Data project is where we keep the things that are going to be interacting more closely with the database. Any of our in Hibernate implementation stuff goes in the data project. Connection strings, any connection string infrastructure goes here. We've even got some HBM mappings so that we can make the nHibernate work well with Azure, Windows Azure SQL database. And for instance, our repository implementations are actually here. Here's our writable repository. It takes in an iSession. iSession is an nHibernate. nHibernate owns that type. So we would never have this repository in the domain layer unless we were abstracting somehow the session, and even then I don't think it would belong there. So this session is owned by nHibernate. We've got it injected directly into our repository, and then we're basically kind of almost adapting using our own repository class to reuse the session that's provided to us by nHibernate. Allende doesn't say that you shouldn't even. He says that you shouldn't do this at all. But if we didn't adapt or wrap or put a facade around the session by doing something like this, then we would be injecting iSession into our domain level or application layer classes, which to me would make it a lot dirtier, and it would also make it harder to unit test, because iSession is notoriously hard for unit testing.
Allende has changed his
Really?
talk very times.
Okay.
Right now, he said the repository is a bad pattern. It's like, he say a repository is like more like how I say the static pattern is bad for him. But right now he is selling a database, so he is in the another side.
Gotcha. So now he's okay with repository pattern.
No, right now no.
No, right now he's not. Okay.
Hey.
Well, I listen to Allende about 50% of the time, and besides, like I said, if we don't wrap this iSession in something, then we're going to end up mixing nHibernate stuff in our domain, and it would feel messy.
And it's a messy if you do that.
Yeah, and this is not like a big super difficult class. It costs us nothing. It's 57 lines, including using statements and brackets. So this repository adds almost zero technical overhead to our project, and it gives us a lot. So I'm a believer in repositories. Another thing to mention is that in this data project, this is also where we are storing all of our auto mapping overrides. Now, right now, there is no, there is not really any auto mapping overrides going on. But if we at some point needed to override the default mappings that Fluent and Hibernate does for us, then we can do that here. We can say mapping has many, and we can get all kinds of crazy. Hopefully, this is not necessary very often, but in every project there are opportunities to do this, or there are times when it's needed. So these classes that are here are more like just signposts, so that when it's time to do some auto mapping overriding, then we can do it from here. Any questions about the data layer?
Nope, nothing.
Nope.
Okay. It looks pretty familiar to you guys, I guess. We've seen this before. Okay.
Byron, where is the commit? In data layer, where is the commit?
It is not in the data layer. It is in the web layer. I'll show it to you. So in the API folder of the web project, there is a infrastructure and configuration folder. And if you look for configure database wiring, you'll see that we're using the AutoFac container and the lifetime scope to simulate a unit of work. And for most projects, this seems to work. This might again evolve over time. So people watching this several months later you might not see this code in this bootstrapper task anymore. But for now, this is how it does it. When the request comes in to Nancy, it creates a lifetime scope, and then when it activates that lifetime scope, then it tries to start a new transaction if it's not already active. And then as the request is dying off, it releases the lifetime scope, and it runs this event, which it checks if the transaction is active, then it commits it. And then it disposes of the session factory. Does that answer your question,
Okay.
Dante?
Answer my question.
Okay. This is not always ideal. Sometimes this works great. Sometimes this causes problems. So it depends on the project. And I've got it in here for right now just because StarScream is supposed to represent the majority of projects to get things started. And then as a project gets to the point where it doesn't need this kind of thing, it needs something else, then we can change that. Or over time, if we realize that we want something else better, then this will go away in StarScream and something else will come in. All right, any other questions about the data layer?
Nope.
All right, so let's take a look at the email clients. This is so simple. It's just implementing the SMTP client interface that comes from our AcklandAvenue.email assembly, and it's just implementing the straight up .NET SMTP client that pulls all of its configuration out of the web or app config. That's it. And this just it takes in the email address, the subject, and the body already rendered. Everything is finished and ready to go. This Razor project has something else that's also being defined by our Ackland Avenue email project, which is the iView engine. iView engine takes in a model and a formatted string. So what we're expecting is that it's going to spit out another string, but one where all the properties have been changed with values. So it's very simple. Here's the Razor view engine implementation of that, and it's just using the Razor view engine helper class to parse the formatted string using the dynamic model. All right, so let's talk about the web project as our last project, our last thing in the folder structure to talk about. I've got the API, which we've seen. This folder should contain most of the C# assets that we need for the project. This would be everything that we need to run the actual API. I see a few things that probably need to be moved in, like the emails folder. In fact, I'll go ahead and do that now. The idea is to keep all the stuff that we use to create the API all in this API folder, because as you can see, the rest of the site is, with the exception of some config files, the rest of the site is our app, which is like the Angular site, and then assets, which is our scripts and CSS and things like that. So back to the API layer, we've got emails, which is this is pulling interfaces that are defined by the AcklandAvenue.email. And this in particular is just creating a password reset email template. It's going to implement both the body and the subject in one class, and it's just returning a static string. But as you can see here, it's got the Razor view engine tokens here. So it's going to send an email to the user saying, here's your reset URL, click this. And then the subject is right here. Now, as Javier found out just the other day, this can, instead of returning a static string, this could actually also just go out to the file system and get an HTML file out of a folder. just as easily. And then you can, at that point, have your HTML files separate and outside of the C# realm. And for these, it's a little bit barbaric, but for these, it uses this this for type. That way, it knows how to which email model this template should be used for.
All right.
So there's an infrastructure folder, and the infrastructure folder is trying to. It's got some helper classes that help Nancy know how that we want it to handle requests and things like that. So there's authentication. This is controlling how we verify and get the logged in user. We're using REST. So when the user logs in, we are going to give back an API token, and then for every subsequent call after that, the Angular stuff, when it's making API calls, it has to pass that same token in every time, so that we're not storing a server cookie, the server is not pushing a cookie out to the client. We're not using forms authentication or anything like that. We're using token or stateless authentication. In the configuration folder, this is where we have most of our things like the Bootstrapper tasks that run. If we ever have to add a Bootstrapper task, all you have to do is just go to the Bootstrapper here, and a Bootstrapper task is like something that needs to happen as the app is starting up, as we're spinning up the server or spinning up a request. Actually, in this case, it's spinning up the server. So it's going to run this configure common dependencies, and then it's going to run this configure database wiring, and then it's going to configure the auto mappings. But if there are more things that need to happen, like if there's some sort of third-party API where we need to somehow authenticate the server or subscribe the server, or who knows. But if there's something that needs to happen at the startup of the app, then we would just add another here, another configure something. So configure something, and then you implement that, and you've got this new Bootstrapper task that comes complete with a container builder. So I'm just going to return a container builder, and inside of this method right here, I can say builder dot. Then I've got access to the entire container builder, the AutoFact container builder. So I can do register type. I can do register. And I'm going to mess up the syntax, but there you can do anything that you need to with the container, or if you don't care about the container, then you don't have to use it. Just ignore that container and do whatever you need to do here. Whether it's like, I don't know, it might be cleaning up files in an image folder or in a cache folder. It could be anything. So this is just if you have something new that you need to do in a startup process. Bootstrapper task. So I'm going to get this back off of here. Cool. Okay. In this folder also I've got the an implementation of the AutoFact Bling dispatcher, and this is what is responsible for getting those Bling handlers that we've created, the event handlers, and actually dispatching them. We've got a folder for exceptions. We've got a folder for REST exceptions. REST exceptions are interesting because, and this is something else that we need to extract and put into a NuGet package. But we have a system in here that that intercepts any exception that might happen as a result of anything in the request pipeline, and it will intercept that exception, and turn it into a REST, a JSON response that gives an appropriate response status. So we can look at one of these. Token doesn't exist exception. You know what? What I meant was repackagers. So we got exceptions and we've got repackagers. So a repackager basically, an exception repackager takes the exception and repackages it into something else. So for instance, there's this not found exception repackager, and when it tries to handle this, it's going to handle it only if the name of the exception contains not found. And then if it can handle it, then it's going to basically return the this error response, which then is going to be serialized into JSON or XML, depending on what Nancy wants. So if we have different types of exceptions that we want the UI to get, that we don't want the UI to see a 500, we want them to see maybe a not found or a forbidden or you name it, then you just create a REST exception repackager implementing the iException repackager class, and then you can go on from there. An authorized exception repackager, here's another one. This one is only going to run if the exception is of type unauthorized exception, access exception. So then it's going to return the message, and it's going to set the HTTP status code as unauthorized. So a lot better than the HTML exceptions that used to come back. We have one root module here in the infrastructure, and that's just to return the index HTML. So we have a separate modules folder, but the modules folder is more for the API responses. This root module is just a circumstance. We have to have something in here to return the index HTML, or else it won't be accessible. But this is a good example of how Nancy handles routes. So we've got this get, and we're saying that when there's a get request on the root, the site root, then we're going to return the view index HTML. Doesn't get much easier than that. So here's a modules folder. This identity extension doesn't belong in here. Web API infrastructure. All right, so we've got another class that needs to be moved out. Folder Nazi strikes again. All right, so we have two modules in our modules folder. Both modules deal with API requests. So these are not going to be returning views ever. They're only returning either exceptions, throwing exceptions, or they are going to return some object that's going to get serial. If you remember, authorized access exception. So by throwing it here, we're basically throwing that exception out to be repackaged into an unauthorized JSON response.
Okay.
User account module is a little bit more interesting. It has some posts and puts. In this, because we're not just doing gets, we have a command dispatcher being injected. So we have a post to the register route. So we're expecting this route to receive a post payload of some sort, and we're going to bind the new user request. Basically, we're going to suck all that data from the request into an object so that we can then do C# things with it. So let's take a look at the new user request. It's just a very simple, we're not using encapsulation, it's got public setters and getters, and it's just got some properties on it. So that's just making the C# object available to the serializer deserializer. Go ahead.
It's a simple data structure.
Yeah. Say that again?
It's a simple data structure.
Yeah, that's right. It's a DTO, maybe. It's just
Yes.
providing us with a way to get the stuff out of the request and into the C# land. So then here you've seen this before. We're going to dispatch the command using the command dispatcher that we injected. And again, we're passing in a user session, which really doesn't matter because we're just registering. But here's where the magic happens. We're creating a command, create user. Commands are always named with an imperative, some sort of like do this, build house, cut tree, pick fruit. So it's always some sort of imperative command. And it's using encapsulation, so we're passing in these arguments into the constructor, the email address. We're encrypting the password right as soon as we get it, so we're passing in an encrypted password, the user's name, and the user's phone number. And here it's using the request that came out of the HTTP request. And then since it's a post, we're just going to return null. When you return null in Nancy, it returns a blank response with a 200 status, which means just like A-OK, everything's good, thank you. We'll take it from here. Because remember, we don't have any guarantee that this command is going to be processed right now. It might be processed in 15 seconds from now, depending on how we have it implemented. So we don't let the UI ever depend on instant responses. So if we have a post, put, or delete, those are considered commands. We always return null. So we've got two posts in here. One where we're going to post a request. We're asking for a request, a reset request to be created. So we're again dispatching a command. And then this is one that I have in progress right now that I'm just returning null for right now. And I'm going to be changing. I'm going to be resetting the password. I'm going to use a put for that. I think it's a little bit more appropriate than a post. Any questions about modules?
No, I don't have.
No, neither do I.
You good? Did I leave anything out?
I don't think so.
One thing that might be interesting is, so we might be able to ask the question, well, we're injecting these two things, but where are they being, how are we defining which concrete classes to inject? So I'm gonna go to the common dependencies configuration. Configure common dependencies. So in this Bootstrapper task, I am registering the different dependencies that are needed. So I'm auto-registering the data and domain services. That way I don't have to do that manually. Anything that's like I haven't figured out yet how to register between like something that's the interface is defined in one assembly and then the concrete is in another assembly. So I'm still doing this manually. So like I've got the IMapper engine, my IMapping engine, so I'm going to register that instance here. The base URL provider, okay, I remember why. So when you try to auto-register things in any assembly that uses Nancy, you've got to do all kinds of filtering. I haven't figured out it yet. So when you try to auto-register anything using the Nancy assembly, then it throws all kinds of runtime errors because it starts trying to auto-register things that shouldn't be registered or that have already been registered. So that might evolve over time when we finally figure out how to do that. But this is, to answer that question, this is basically where everything gets registered. And by registered, I mean we're telling the IOC container, when you see this interface, use this concrete class. So some of that is auto registering, some of that is manual registering here, where we're saying do this, then this. And this is one method where we're actually trying to do an auto register between the data and the domain projects, just trying to say, hey, go and use all of these assemblies. All right, so we talked about the modules. We got requests and responses. These are just DTOs. The response, I try to use more encapsulation on the responses, but sometimes it doesn't work very well if I'm trying to do some acceptance testing and reuse the same response. So I'm not a big Nazi when it comes to encapsulation and requests and responses. They're just DTOs. So
Yes, Byron.
yeah, they're
I
just a
believe
way to move
that
some
is
data back and
correct.
forth.
Yes, I believe this is correct because that kind of object is not really an object because it doesn't have behaviors.
Yeah, I agree.
It's only data structures. You send out, you send in.
Totally agree. So one thing that I would like to mention before we move on to the Angular stuff is that this password reset email sender, we saw it before. This is one of our Bling handlers. It's in the web project because, well, I'll start out with the most practical reason why it's in the web project and not in something like the domain project. The most practical reason is because it has a dependency on the email sender and the well, the email sender is enough because the email sender is part of the Ackland Avenue email project. And so if I were to put this in the domain project, then it would require me to put a dependency to the email project into the domain. And I didn't feel good about that. So it felt better to put this in the web project. On the other hand, another reason why it might be a good idea to have your event handlers in the projects that trigger them, meaning like we're in the web project, we do something, we request a reset token from the web project. If we have this in the web project, then that means that we might be able to say that the email came from the web instead of a desktop. I don't know if that's a really good reason. That might sound really silly in 5 years, but anyway, that's the reason why it's here. The cool thing though is these Bling handlers can actually be in any assembly as long as you register them properly, and your site can your IOC container can discover them. Then you can have them in any assembly. So technically, they can be anywhere, and for me, better not in the domain. Sometimes the domain event handlers do belong in the domain, I think, but this one, no.
Yes, I believe that. Byron, I believe that we need to separate all the logic for email in another system, only related with logic for email. Uh, I believe this is more usable for another projects.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the idea behind this Ackland Avenue email project. One of our cards for the current sprint is to extract this email logic out to a public open source repository in GitHub, and then a NuGet package. And so I've already tried to extract this stuff out, stuff that's reusable by other projects, stuff that doesn't have StarScream specific logic and work. But hopefully this gets us moving in the right direction.
Yes.
Okay, so last thing, well, here, before I move on to that, let's talk about connection strings. So there's two projects in the solution that really depend on connection strings. They are the database deployer and the web project. Both of them have a separate connection strings config. So if you look at the web config and you go to the connection strings node, you see here that we're using config source. Config source allows us to extract that whole XML node out to another file. So instead of having it all in here, we can have it in a separate file, and that means that we can do funny things like having this default and then the real one, and then using a build event, which is what we have in this web project that if it doesn't exist, if this connection strings.config doesn't exist, then it's going to create it by copying from the config.default. And that works because in our GitHub, or our git ignore file, we're not checking in any connection strings.config. That allows all developers who are working on it to have different connection strings, and so that we're not changing the connection strings on each other and walking on each other. That's the reason for that. So this default is one that does get checked into GitHub, and its values are going to get, if you don't have the connection strings.config, you're going to get a copy, and it's going to be this one, and then you can go in and change it however you want to. So both of these projects, the database deployer and the web project, have this. Now, if you look in the app settings, both projects also have an app settings with an environment key. Now you can change this from local to QA to release, whatever connection strings we have. If we've got 5 environments, you can choose one of 5 different values right here. It starts out with local, so that you'll be using a local database. This word local is the same as what's being looked for here in the connection strings. It's looking for a connection string called local. So then if you want to switch your local debug environment to use the QA database, then you can say QA right here, and then you'll be running against the QA database. Same thing works for the database deployer. Any questions about connection strings, web config?
Nothing.
Okay. All right, so I've got 4 minutes left. Let me run through the Angular stuff really quick. So if you're familiar with Angular at all, you know that there's going to be at least one index.html or one basically root HTML file. And I used to call this Ivory Tower, so there's still some Ivory Tower stuff floating around. So this HTML file has all of our JavaScript references, all of our CSS references. It has a few Angular-ish tokens that are going to be used at some point. And then we're saying here ng app StarScream, ng controller, parent controller. And I'll show you that controller in just a moment. But the very, very important thing that we have here is this thing at line 60, ng view. This div is where all of the other views are going to be loaded. So so if there's a footer right here and it's in the index, then it's going to be on every single page. If we only want footers on certain pages, then we would only add those footers to those pages, or we would create sub-parent views, like a child of this parent that gets used as a parent. If that's confusing, then sorry. There's going to be some other things that you're going to have to Google, I'm sure. But this ng view gets replaced at runtime by any of these views, depending on the controller that's being used. So in my app folder, Dante, I think your microphone is starting to mess up.
All right, I will get.
So in the app.js, this is where the application starts. So we're going to define our routes here in the app.js. So we're saying anytime that we're using the login route, we're going to use this view and this controller. Anytime we're using forgot password or reset password, we're going to use this view and this controller. And let's see if there's anything else in here that's interesting. It's going to intercept any HTTP request, and if there's ever any kind of response error, it's going to check it. And if the response status is a 401 or unauthorized, then it's going to redirect the user to log in. That's how that part works. It's also going to be intercepting any posts, pushes, posts and puts that go out, and it's going to try to append this bearer token onto the authorization header before it lets the request go on out. That's some stuff that happens in the background there. And so in the foreground, we've got some controllers. I've got a parent controller, which you remember seeing on the index HTML. And this is the controller that is binding to that parent page, and it's just providing some things like the username, a logout function. That way, we can put the username and a logout button in the header of the page. And then we've got some other controllers in here, like the home controller, the login controller. And let's see. So let's look at the home controller. Pretty much nothing, except that if there is no user in the user service, then we're going to redirect them to the login screen. Login screen is pretty simple also, except that it has a nice little method on it. So we're getting the login, and we're going to hit the login service, pass in the email address from the user and also the password. And when we get a response back, we're going to log their data in our user service, and then we're going to redirect them to the root path. And then if there's ever an error, we just use this promise, this catch, and then return the error response to the UI. So this is the login controller. Let's look at the login view. In the login view, we've got some things in here that are helping to control how the data is bound to the view. For instance, this ng model. Ng model is basically just putting the value from the controller into the text or the value of this input. So this user email corresponds to the user email that is right here, scope user email. Let's look for here the ng submit. So when the form is submitted, it's going to run this login function. That login function corresponds with the login function right here on the scope. So it gets executed as a function. It's going to pull in the stuff from the scope, just like we said. So that's our controllers folder. We've got services, where we've already seen the user service that was injected into our login controller, our home controller, a few other controllers, and that's got a get user on it. It's also got a set user, and these are just JavaScript functions that can be used to help control the environment. Anytime we have things that reach out to an external service, like our API, those would be going through a service. We have this HTTP queue, which is kind of cool. For some reason, Angular decided to use HTTP, use a different type of promise structure for things coming back from posts and puts and deletes and gets, and I wanted us to be able to use the same promise structure for everything. So this HTTP queue is really just wrapping the HTTP client with the queue promise structure. That's all there. That's all with views. We've got some interceptors, but I think, no, we don't have any interceptors, so I'm going to delete them. Those are blank. Cool, so that's actually that's the entire project, a little walkthrough of the folder structure at least, and maybe some of the architectural things that are going on. Any questions before we stop?
Nothing.
Victor, you never have questions.
Yeah, I have all the answers of the
You
universe.
have all the answers.
Or you do.
I had one.
Okay.
Are we going to move that Angular part to another project or a separate solution, something like that?
I think that it can remain right now a part of this project. That was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to keep the API stuff in its own folder, because at that point it's much easier to see if we want to move the Angular stuff out to another project. It's much easier to do that. It's just easier to see which files. You just move the assets, the app, and the index HTML. That's it.
Yes. Okay. Sounds perfect.
And the API, if somebody's working in the front end on something, then you can actually use Sublime Text. You could use Notepad++, or plus 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 plus. You can use anything. You don't have to use Visual Studio when you're working with that JavaScript stuff. Yeah, you can use Notepad. You can use Vim. Whatever.
Whoa, it's all.
Yeah. Anything else?
No, I'm fine.
I'm fine.
Okay. Cool. Well, this has been another live Google Hangout by Ackland Avenue, talking about our wonderful StarScream project, and I hope it's been helpful to you. And let's get to work. See ya.